TBD Podcast. Welcome in, everybody. Today we have a guest all the way from Boston virtually, Jeff Speck. Jeff, welcome to the show.
Garrett, great to be here, or there, or wherever I am. I guess I'm here, but I'm also there.
You're in the cloud. You are nowhere and everywhere at once. So, Jeff, for people that don't know you, let me just say, you were probably the first inspiration. You sparked my interest in walkable cities and more broadly, the resurgence of the American downtown. I think you were the first person who I listened to who made me realize, wait a second, maybe American cities don't have it all figured out. I did a lot of traveling when I was younger to Europe, was even fortunate to go to places like Africa and Asia. And when you go abroad and come back to America, you noticed a very stellar difference in livability and urban cores abroad. And your ideas, I think, match and align up with a lot of other cities around the globe. So, Jeff, just to first start, how did you even get interested in this subject? Obviously, you've had a long career specifically in this subject, but how did you first get interested?
You know, I was briefly an investment banker, and I'm going to silence my phone out of true respect for the podcast.
Probably a good move.
I was briefly an investment banker, and I suspected, though, that I was going to go back to school for architecture. And I was prepared to study the art of architecture, which I guess I still did, and to launch into a career designing the kitchens and bathrooms of the very rich. And then in 1989, I heard a talk at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts from a fellow named Andres Duany. And Andres Duany was partners with Elizabeth Plater-Zyberk, and Duany Plater-Zyberk had designed this new town called Seaside that, if you were paying attention in the mid-'80s, was the most exciting thing happening in urban design in the U.S. And I had previously stumbled across a book that discussed Seaside, and I have the notes that I took as I was reading that book, and it said, non-rhetorically, it said, if you're interested in urban design, find these people. And that was the extent of my coverage. And then I heard Andres speak at the Museum of Fine Arts. And he gave this talk, and he was, barnstorming the country, giving this talk everywhere for maybe 5 to 10 years. He won't give it anymore, and I still give versions of it because I find it so compelling. And the talk was called Towns versus Sprawl. And it was the best story I'd ever heard. It was essentially a discussion of how, as you kind of implied a bit from your travel experience, we love certain places, we feel great in them, we want to be in them, we hate other places, and maybe we understand why and maybe we don't. And this talk kind of lifted the veil from my eyes and made me understand what the differences were between places that I like spending time in and I didn't want to spend time in. It also communicated how it was now pretty much illegal in the U.S., as it had been for decades, really half a century, to build more places of the kind of places that we love. And it drew my attention to this movement that was just getting started, that didn't have a name yet. They were calling it neo-traditional urban design or neo-traditional architecture, which was not about style, not about traditional forms, but about a return to the traditional city. And that's the distinction between neighborhoods and sprawl. And there's 1,000 ways to design a city, but there's only 2 ways that have been tested by the thousands, and that's the traditional neighborhood and suburban sprawl. And this talk taught me what the difference was between those 2 things. And it set me on, it dumped me into this movement to make it legal again to build the kind of places we love and to start building more of these kind of places. The other great realization I had when I heard Andres speak was this needs to be a book. And I actually wrote them a letter and said, can I ghostwrite a book for you that's called Towns versus Sprawl? And they never wrote me back. And happily, though, it began our relationship, and I worked with them a couple summers. And then when I got out of architecture school, literally 4 years later, during a recession when it was very hard to find work. I was just very lucky that a project manager had quit. And so they had an opening, and I went to join that firm, DPZ, in Miami, where I spent a decade working on about 40 projects, either managing or leading 40 different projects, of about 20 of which have been built, and you could visit. New towns like Seaside, one called Rosemary Beach that's near Seaside that's pretty awesome. Downtown master plans for places like Baton Rouge and Fort Myers. And eventually, about 8 years later, maybe 12 years since I asked, no, it was about 8 years since I asked, I convinced them to let me write that book with them. And that book was called Suburban Nation. You may have heard of it, but it was pretty much the best-selling planning book of the 2000s. And the Wall Street Journal called it the Urbanist's Bible. And Suburban Nation was basically that towns versus sprawl argument put out there for a generalist audience. The book still sells quite well. And that kind of launched my career because people saw the book with our three names on the cover. I didn't have to ghostwrite it anymore because I was a little more senior, right?
Yeah.
They saw our three names on the cover, and they thought that I was, people reached the conclusion that I was one of the ideators of this movement. When I'm really second generation, I was very lucky to join it at the right time. But that's how I got launched. And I never did my proper architectural internship. I never became a registered architect, although I do design buildings, happily with none of the liability because I always get someone else to stamp them. But most of my work since 1993, when I got out of school, so for 30 years, most of my work has been the same two things, essentially new towns and neighborhoods, and also downtown master plans and downtown plans, with a lot of smaller urban design efforts and urban infill and suburban retrofit and urban retrofit projects as well.
There's been so many new towns built. I feel like, especially here in Florida, I'm sure all over the country, but it seems like Florida's gotten a lion's share of those planned developments. We're in Tampa here. You drive down 75, you've got Lakewood Ranch and Parish and all of these planned communities. And then you mentioned in the Panhandle, Seaside, Rosemary Beach. Seaside, for people that don't know, we actually spoke about it last episode with Walton Chancey Design. He's got a lot of projects up there, but that's kind of how he got his start in architecture too, was Seaside. That at the time, man, I bet that blew the lid off of what people thought urban design was. I've heard Seaside come up many times. That must have just been amazing.
Well, it was strangely revolutionary in 1979, 1980, that this developer, Robert Davis, and Andres and Liz together said, hey, could we make a new town that has the DNA of old towns? And, they looked at Defuniak Springs. They looked at all the other places like Charleston and Savannah that maybe weren't local, but that were the places we loved to visit the most, discovered what that DNA was, looked at the 40 different plans, I believe, that John Nolan, who created the landscape architecture department at Harvard back in the early 20th century, all the plans that he did in Florida for places like Naples and Fort Myers. And it looks a lot like, Seaside looks a lot like a John Nolan plan. It's got a wonderful street network. It's got a clear center. It's got clear edges. It's got a social structure embodied in the plan where you have civic spaces that terminate vistas as you look down the street, right? And the every street ends at a pavilion that crosses over onto the beach. So wherever you live on any of those streets, you feel like you own the beach. And it defied contemporary, conventional real estate in 24 ways. One of which was, for example, the normal thing is to sell off the beach property for the most money you can, which pretty much devalues every piece of property inland from that while getting you a very quick return. Well, Seaside sold off only beach property between the streets, but every street takes you to the beach, which is remarkable. Seaside also got a bad rap for being chosen as the set for the Truman Show, which is how probably most of your listeners know it.
Yep.
I always take some comfort in the fact that they were hoping to film the Truman Show in Greenwich Village in New York City, and when they couldn't get it, they went to Seaside. They did doll it up and make it a little less real, They, tore out the live oaks and put in lollipop trees and did other things to make it look a little more storybook. But the fact is that Seaside, although a resort, functions very much like a traditional American town. And of course, it was only because it was a resort in nowhere, Florida, that it was able to get it done at all. And Andres tells the story of how when they finished Seaside's plans, they rolled the plans up to bring them to the permitting authority, and there was nowhere to bring them, which I think is probably not a true story. But
Santa Rosa County,
there
right?
were no rules.
That's a rural part of Florida, really. I mean, there's not a whole lot going on, especially back in 1979. It was probably all sand dunes and swamp, really.
It was all scrub, yeah. But the fact is that if you look at the history of neighborhood planning in the U.S., the two places it's advanced the most in terms of new ideas is resorts, like the Methodist campgrounds and Chautauquas that you see around the U.S., and graveyards, because there were no rules. The first curvilinear suburb is the Mount Auburn Cemetery that Frederick Law Olmsted designed here in Cambridge. That led the way for curvilinear street design in all the suburbs that he designed subsequently.
Well, even Boston Common, there's a large graveyard there. I feel like if maybe that wasn't platted in that specific location, you might not have that beautiful park in your city.
There's a nice graveyard about a block up that has a big Franklin grave in it and some other things, but there isn't much of a plan to that one. It's just kind of like most of our older graveyards, it's just kind of a whole bunch of headstones that are half fallen over. But so long answer to your short question, I give myself credit for one thing, which is having the wisdom to recognize what was the most important trend in planning and to pick a winner, which wasn't my idea. But then I basically glued myself to Andres and Liz for 10 years and learned absolutely everything I could from them. The success of Suburban Nation opened a lot of doors for me. And as a result, after 10 years at DPZ, I was appointed the director of design at the National Endowment for the Arts, where I got to move to Washington, one of the most walkable cities in the U.S. by a long shot. And I mention that only because I spent the next 4 years, among other things, overseeing something called the Mayor's Institute on City Design. The Mayor's Institute on City Design is now, I think, 40 years old. It was founded by Joe Riley and other partners, such as the NEA. Joe Riley was mayor of Charleston, South Carolina, for 40 years. And he said he woke up one morning and slapped his forehead and he said, "Oh my gosh, I'm the lead urban designer of my city and I didn't even know it. And mayors need to understand urban design better." And so with Jack Robertson, a famous architect, and the Adele Chatfield Taylor at the NEA, they founded this thing called the Mayor's Institute, where literally every 2 months somewhere in the U.S., we would gather up 8 mayors, 8 urban designers, and lock them in a room for 3 days. Each mayor would bring their toughest urban design challenge, and we would try to solve it. Case study method, like the Harvard Business School. We try to solve each case study during that visit. Ostensibly, that was the goal of the program, to help the mayors with their urban design issues. The subtext was we were really trying to teach them how to be better urban designers. And the subtext was that we wanted to send them back to their cities as design mayors. So someone who's going to hitch their wagon to the star of design and say, this is important to me.
And
Mayor Riley would tell them, absolutely, it's still going strong.
Yeah.
And it's a joint effort of the National Endowment for the Arts and the U.S. Conference of Mayors, who supplies the mayors to every institute. And the NEA, and it was my job, two a year, it was my job to supply the urban designers, which of course included not just urban designers, but architects, landscape architects, engineers, mayors who had done great things in their city, and a variety of other people who collectively are responsible for creating the public realm. Those were the people that we brought to advise the mayors. And ideally, Mayor Riley would say to them, Mayor, if you balance the budget, that's great. But if you build a park, you'll be remembered. And that was the sort of message that we
Especially
we sent
if you
them
slap
home
your
with.
name on it.
Yeah, there you go. But I learned so much. My second education after being at DPZ for the entirety of my 30s was working with all those mayors all those years. And
Man, what a perspective you gained at such a young age for urban design.
I wasn't that young, but for an architect, it's young.
Well, hey, I'm 32. I'm still, I'm in that realm.
You're a baby.
Yeah.
But I wanted to say one more thing, which was that
Sure.
the lessons I learned from the Mayor's Institute, in addition to DPZ, were what led to me writing Walkable City, which is how most people know me.
Right.
Which is that in 2012, my book Walkable City came out and became the best-selling planning book since that time. And it's been an entree for me. Now I give lectures about twice a month somewhere around the U.S. and the world. I found out this morning I'm going to Guayaquil, Ecuador on Monday.
Oh, wow.
Not for a lecture, but for a project. But that
Wow.
book has really opened a lot of doors for me.
Well, it's how, like I said, that's how I found you initially. And I think your ideas, in a very interesting way, go back in time to maybe what we had 100 or maybe a little further than that years ago. I have a map here in my studio of the old trolley network of Tampa's urban core. We had an entire streetcar network that served every neighborhood in the entire city. It was bulldozed and ripped up in the 1940s after the advent of the automobile, and it hasn't been back only until the early 2000s. We put one line in. I'm sure you're aware, from Ybor City into downtown.
The toy transit that goes through Water Street.
You know what, though? It's better than nothing. I'll say that. And by the way, good luck getting that pushed through today. I feel like it's getting harder and harder to at least implement some of these ideas. Hopefully not, though. Maybe part of what you can share today is how, as a city, we can come together and advocate for some of these things. I would
comment about streetcars that
Sure.
Every city that had a population of more than 10,000 had a streetcar system. And they were pulled out to the glee of almost everyone. But it's important to understand, not only were people embracing this new technology of cars and shiny new buses, but they were not working anymore. And the reason they weren't working anymore is they were running in the street, stuck behind cars. So what really killed the streetcar systems, which I've only learned quite recently, was the fact that they became crippled. Their efficiency was crippled by the congestion of the private automobiles that were in their path.
Well, I actually read, I think there's a write-up from a long, long time ago called Streetcar Conspiracy. I forgot the author. It was actually, I believe, a woman. But she was writing about how the automobile industry, right? So the companies that manufacture the metals, the tires, right? The designers
Asphalt.
of the highways, asphalt, that entire industry really pushed to have all those streetcars removed, and actually got together and made them less efficient, even ended up buying some of the streetcar lines and turned down their frequency, turned down their efficiency.
Yes.
And so people didn't ride them. And so if people don't ride them, then the community says, tear them up anyway.
They were
Right?
they were found guilty of criminal conspiracy. They were fined $5. And that is the story of Who Framed Roger Rabbit, that movie from a while ago.
Yeah.
So
Story of America.
in
really.
fact, it was a conspiracy, but it was more than just their actions that caused the demise. But you go to a place like Melbourne, for example, which still has streetcars running in corridor after corridor after corridor, and you see what that does for the city. Melbourne, to my experience, has more linear miles of non-chain retail than any other place I've ever been. And it's all on the streetcar lines. And it's remarkable how that sort of transportation system then leads to a much more vibrant and local business system.
Well, even looking at old pictures of American cities, it doesn't even have to be Tampa. That's just where I live. That's the example I use, right? But look at pictures of old Detroit or New Orleans, or you name an American city that existed in the turn of the 19th and 20th centuries, and it looked like a European city. I mean, we had the density, we had the walkability and the transit. We've gone so far from that. And in some ways, Jeff, really what you're advocating for is a step back into that old American city, more of a European-centric, less car-centric model. So what the hell happened, right? Like, how did we get so far away of what was once great?
Well, I'm reading The Power Broker now. I am 35 hours into a 60-hour audiobook.
Wow.
Robert Caro's book, The Power Broker, about the life of Robert Moses, who is famous as being the most powerful American that's ever lived, even though he was never elected to any office, who not only completely remade the New York metropolitan area, but actually had a tremendous influence nationwide and beyond, causing other cities throughout the U.S. to emulate his methods. And he ideologically was raised at a time when the car was becoming available, and of course was this amazing, amazing tool that folks like him saw as the only way to get around because it was the future. Additionally, as the book makes potently clear, he had no real concern, aside from a paternalistic one, for people on the lower end of the income ladder, and had a complete disdain and lack of care for minorities and poor people. And that also strongly powered his decision to reorganize the landscape around private automobiles and to never fund transit, to disenfranchise transit. Famously, the bridges he built along the roads that connected New York City to his incredible Jones Beach playground and beach in Long Island, the bridges were too low to allow buses to go through because he didn't even want poor people to be able to get to those facilities. He never questioned, and in fact, was a leading proponent around the idea that the car was the only way to get around. And he remade New York City, and then all the other cities imitated the work he was doing with that intention. It's what the transit planner Jarrett Walker would now call elite projection. Except elite projection is kind of benevolent, and it's people who mean to do well, but don't understand because they're unaware of the way other people live, that the way that they live is not how the world works. So elite projection, for example, is Mexico City, which I visited a number of years ago, investing in widening roads and reducing tolls and making it more expensive to ride the bus, when 80% of the people who come to Mexico City every day don't have cars. But of course, the people in charge, both in the business world and in the political world, have cars and drivers. And so they think that's how the world works.
Right.
So unfortunately, Garrett, when you talk about my desire to recreate European-style cities, you have to meet cities where they're at. And right now, we have this condition where most Americans, even poor Americans, do have cars and depend on cars. Not the poorest, and clearly anything you can do to invest in alternatives to driving are disproportionately benefiting lower income people, particularly bicycle investments, which have this impression of being, again, an elite, bike commuting is seen in some circles as an elite activity, when in fact 38.5% of the people who bike to work or school are from the lowest 25% of income earners. So anything you can do to improve biking, to improve walking, to improve transit is helping the people with the least. But most American cities, most people are driving, and so you have to address them from that starting point. Certainly, Tampa is one of the worst.
And in Florida, you do have these amazing hurricanes that come through, horrible hurricanes, really, that come through every season. You got to get people out. You need millions of people to get out of a state. Really, the only way to do that feasibly with our current setup is a highway system and cars.
With your current setup.
Right.
Yes.
With our current setup. Where did this...
Although one would think that one could grab the Bright Line and get quite far now.
Yeah, true.
Along the coast.
All the way to Orlando now, too, which is fantastic. Yeah. I think if
you need to know which way it's headed.
Yeah. If any state really could use a high-speed rail system, I would argue Florida. We've got over 20 million people in a relatively dense state, and our cities are large and close by, really closer than California cities are. I think it would be great here. Unfortunately, our government for a long time at the state level has shied away from some of the funding that maybe would have made that happen in the last couple decades. Is what it is, though, I guess, right?
Condition. I used to think these things were politically kind of neutral. That good planning was good planning. It's very clear, though, that the most and by the way, most of my client cities have been either red cities or in red states, interestingly, because they understand the economic value of walkability. But now we have a condition where the most rabid fringe of the right wing, which now controls the Republican Party, unfortunately, at least at the national level, it controls the Republican Party, is vociferously anti-transit, anti-anything that would improve the environment, and pro-car.
A lot of it comes from the conservative ideology to not spend tax dollars, period. And there's a hard stop there. And unfortunately, if you're not willing to spend tax dollars, you're not going to receive these amazing benefits we're talking about, especially public transit.
Meanwhile, they're very happy to spend tremendous tax dollars on freeway expansions. So it's actually a focus on the replacement of the public good with the private good. So one strain that runs through libertarianism and that sort of approach to communities is a rejection of contributing to some collective good, like a transit system, as opposed to the fact that I can have my own automobile, which gives me complete self-control and autonomy. Never mind if I can't evacuate because of the congestion that all those automobiles cause on the highway.
Yeah, I mean, even like back then, the map I have of the trolley network is from 1914. I believe that was before the income tax. I mean, this is long before we were taxing for public transit. I believe it was a private electric company that owned and operated the streetcar here locally. Maybe the same story is true for the rest of the cities in America.
Almost every streetcar system was financed and built by private developers in order to bring value to property at some distance from downtown. So they were essentially valuing property that was hard to get to by creating that access. And interestingly, and I talk about this in Walkable City, the new transit systems that have been most successful, for example, in Portland, in Seattle, and in Kansas City, were all paid for principally by people along the line who wanted that benefit. And if you can't get people along the line or at the end of the line to pay for the streetcar system, it's probably not going to be that effective. And a good example of that is Oklahoma City, which I did a downtown street plan that modified all their downtown streets. But they also put in a streetcar that was perceived as this kind-hearted civic action, but because the economics and the parties didn't exist to motivate the path of the streetcar to serve those places where people were going, it is suffering from extremely low ridership.
The challenge we have locally is the taxpayers. So Hillsborough County has about 1.4 million people. There's about 400,000 people that live within the city of Tampa, and then the million comes from outside the municipality. So that those million people, they're not as willing to vote and to fund a transit network because they feel they won't use it. And the people in the city are frustrated, and it's hard to get those taxpayers and those voters to go along with a program that they might not use. So I think what we're both alluding to is really a shift in the American culture, but in the American mindset of a contributing society is better for us all, where I think today people are very individualistic. And if they're not going to use it, they're not going to vote for it, and they don't want their tax dollars to fund it. And that's a problem we're in, and it's really the pinch point and why locally we haven't gotten really anything done in transportation in a long time.
Well, I mean, that's why my practice is focused on short-term benefits to either, there's the Newtown work, of course, which takes a little more time, but there's a lot of focus on short-term benefits to existing city centers, many of which are principally automotive. And the question is, for my clients, before the next election, how can they see a change? And that's where we don't focus on regional planning and we don't focus on putting in transit systems, but rather we do focus, although it's not something I work on personally, we focus on rerouting bus networks so they're extraordinarily more effective and efficient, which we could talk about. Simply a matter of changing where your buses go and when. But mostly we focus on making the streets in the potentially walkable areas safer and more welcoming and more multimodal. And that's stuff that you can do very short term with paint, right? And see impacts very quickly.
A realistic approach where I believe to pry those voters I'm talking about into a vote that they don't want to cast. Good luck. I mean, that's going to be really hard.
Well, again,
to do.
these are efforts that don't require a referendum or a vote. They're simply redirecting the city's public works budget slightly so that when they repave a street, which they're doing every day somewhere, they're putting in a better street network. And I should say, I've worked on both ends of the spectrum where in Oklahoma City, Devon Energy was building a 51-story skyscraper downtown, generating $200 million in tax increment that they needed to spend on something. So they actually rebuilt most of the streets in the 40-block downtown core of Oklahoma City, which was named the least walkable, it was named the worst city for pedestrians in the entire country by Prevention Magazine. So the mayor said, what do we do? And that's what started our effort there. And over a decade, they spent $200 million. Meanwhile, in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, we did a similar thing where we took what was principally a 4-lane, one-way downtown street system and turned it into a mostly 2-lane, two-way downtown street system. Mm-hmm. They did that with no extra money, but rather over the next 8 years, simply as the downtown streets were being repaved, they restriped them to the new design, adding bike lanes, removing signals and putting in stop signs. Because when you remove a signal and put in an always stop sign, you actually reduce the number of severe injury crashes by about 2/3. All these other tricks that we know. Yeah. Garrett, did you know when you remove the center line from a street, that double yellow stripe, people drive 7 miles an hour slower? They basically stop speeding.
I believe
so.
it.
There's all sorts of little tricks like that we apply in our work that have done a lot to make downtowns just more welcoming to everyone.
Something we're doing here along that line is we are re-bricking 7th Avenue in Ybor City.
Nice.
And asphalt, which is fantastic. I mean, it plays into the historic aspect of what that city was when it was founded, which was just this brick kind of beautiful, walkable, mixed-use urban neighborhood.
Yeah.
But what I think brick roads do is it also slows people down, right? You're not going to drive 50 mile an hour on a brick road. Your car is going to explode, So re-bricking is another interesting way you could get people to drive slower, and it improves aesthetics too. So that's something exciting happening here.
When we did the plan for downtown Fort Myers, when I was at DPZ, we found the bricks under the street and we exposed them. So the main street in Fort Myers is also a brick street now.
We've got a ton of that. There's so much asphalt over our brick roads. I hope that one day we can rip it all up, at least in the historic part of the city. Because like we did say, efficient roads do play a role. The reality is we are in a car-centric world, and you're not going to snap your finger and get rid of that tomorrow. And if you did, so many underprivileged people would be at such a disadvantage, like you said. We're not set up
the question is, are there alternatives in your system? So if there are alternatives, like in New York City,
right?
People are completely disingenuous, claiming that congestion pricing in New York City, which would basically create a $15 toll into Manhattan, and was approved and all set to take place, and we were all watching so ardently for June 30th when it was going to kick in, and it was going to generate billions of dollars in money that they were going to be investing in the transit system. In a place like New York City, where you have that alternative, it's so clear that it's a progressive act, that it's essentially taxing the rich to support the poor. But there's still someone who points to the plumber's apprentice in Staten Island who's got to get his mom to the doctor and paints a picture of, these poor people that, we're going to be crippling them with this tax, when in fact it's exactly the opposite.
Right. Yeah, I feel like a lot of that has happened where a public good that on its face would be fantastic for a majority of the population is somehow PR'd and marketed in this negative way where the governor or a mayor or an executive level person can veto it, and then kind of the whole society looks around and goes, what the hell happened? We were all for this, how did things shift so quickly? Like here locally, we had a transportation referendum and we passed it. I believe it collected a few $100 million, $500 million, I believe. And now it's sitting with the state and it was shot down, all for transportation. You might be familiar with that here locally. So we've dealt with the same thing. And I would imagine a lot of cities around the country and municipalities have dealt with that issue. So
go ahead.
I was just going to say, I don't know if that is a sort of issue moving forward the public can get together and rally behind and make sure that that doesn't happen, because it's so interesting to me that you could have overwhelming public support for something, have a plan, vote on it, have it pass, and yet it still doesn't get done and the funding is still caught up with the state. It's usually in America the will of the people should proceed, but unfortunately that doesn't always happen.
Well, I should say that the instance that you cite, and then also what happened with congestion pricing in New York, which if listeners aren't aware, is that the governor, Kathy Hochul, just unilaterally stopped it from happening at the very last minute, losing the support of just about everyone who cares about planning nationwide. It's quite unfortunate. The way that it plays out mostly in Florida, and in most places I work, but worst in Florida, has to do with street safety and the impact of FDOT. So you have an interesting condition in Florida, which is that many more of the typical Florida, because it's a young state, many more of the typical Florida cities' downtown streets are the property of the state highway department. And state highway departments are notorious, and Florida's particularly so, for designing unsafe, high-speed thoroughfares, even when they pass through delicate little neighborhoods. There's a book called Dangerous by Design that comes out every year. It's issued by a number of organizations, including Smart Growth America, that talks about the epidemic that's currently occurring among pedestrians in the U.S. We have 82% more pedestrian deaths per capita in the U.S. now than we did 14 years ago. And it's principally a function of SUVs, larger vehicles. It's a function of the suburbanization of poverty, the fact that more poor people without cars are now living in environments which were designed with the expectation that everyone would own a car. But whatever the cause, the easiest way to fix it is to make our streets, to design our streets for the speeds that we want people to be driving on them, which in Europe they take as a natural phenomenon. Oh, we want people going 25 miles an hour on the street. We actually design it so you feel uncomfortable going 28 miles an hour. In the US, traffic engineering grew up out of highway engineering, in which your speed is set by the speed limit, right? When I get on a highway, I look for the speed limit and I set my cruise control for 9 miles an hour over the speed limit. That's how we do it. In local streets, that's not how we set our speed. We set our speed based on the environment. But the traffic engineering profession in the US, until quite recently, and still embodied in many of the people who are practitioners currently, was to say we need to create forgiveness. We need to create elbow room. We need clear zones. We need fewer intersections. We need one-way traffic. We need center lines. All the things that make a highway safer, which actually make local streets more dangerous. And so in this book, Dangerous by Design, I think 4 of the 6 most dangerous places to be an American pedestrian are in Florida. And it's specifically due to the impact of FDOT. I have an insane statistic for you that I just learned. And for a long time, I've been talking about how, in different parts of the U.S., depending on how urban or suburban an area is, that determines the car deaths per year in that area. So in New York City, we lose 3.9 Americans per year per 100,000. 3.9 per 100,000 per year in New York due to car crashes. In San Francisco, we lose 4 per 100,000 per year. Old, traditionally organized cities in which you're driving more slowly and you're driving less. In Dallas, that more than doubles to 9.8 per year. In Orlando, it's 17.8 per year. Do you want to guess what the number is for Hillsborough County? We went from 3 to 4 to 10 to 17. And I'll give you a hint, which is Hillsborough County now is not a city. It's a city
Right.
plus a very large suburban area, which has a lot of highways. So it's an unfair comparison in a sense, because when you get from a city to a more rural area, you're having a lot more. But do you want to guess what it is for Hillsborough County?
I'll guess in the 50s.
Yeah, it's 67.6. So Hillsborough County is literally 17 times more dangerous than New York City or San Francisco to be in a car, or to live, actually. It's just if you live there, that's what's going to happen to you.
And
so that's a function of the amount that we're made to drive and the speeds at which we're driving.
What you brought up about some of the more underprivileged communities not having that walkable environment. When you drive up into the kind of eastern part of Tampa, there's a lot of low income people in that area of our city. When you go down like Bush Boulevard, it's like a 8-lane road, a tiny sidewalk. You've got a pedestrian crossing every like half mile. Now they've improved it in recent years, but for so long, you'd have people with their children trying to cross a road with no intersection, standing in a median. It's a horrible way to interact with traffic. You've got one sector of the population in a car not paying attention at all to pedestrians because they're focused on that little yellow line in the road and the 45-mile-an-hour speed limit, and they give no thought, oh, I'm expecting to see a person coming up in the median. They're you know, obviously it's the driver's fault, but at the same time, how do you blame people for not looking for a pedestrian when there really shouldn't be a pedestrian there at all anyway?
Well, often they blame the pedestrians. So there's been a number of court cases, one I believe in Atlanta area, where a mother was sent to jail because she killed her child. She killed her child because it was literally, she would have had to walk a mile out of her way from the bus stop to the housing cluster to get across that big road. So of course she did what a lot of people do, which is they just drag their kids across the street to save 20 minutes in the sun. And one of her kids was killed by a motorist who had no reason to be looking for pedestrians. And that's what I mean when I say the suburbanization of poverty, because, and this is, by the way, very well handled in a book called Right of Way by Angie Schmidt. Right of Way by Angie Schmidt, which told the story about 5 years ago, still completely valid, of these different factors that are adding up to this pedestrian death epidemic. But these parts of the landscape were built under the presumption of mandatory automobile ownership by every adult. Mm-hmm. So meanwhile, they're so unappealing and distant from the city center that if you're poor, they're the place that you're finding it easiest to find a place to live. And if you don't have a car, you're in a very dangerous situation.
And as a city, if you don't own the road, it's kind of hard to make a change, right?
Most of those are state or county roads. In Florida, you also have counties. When we did a downtown street study for Las Olas in Fort Lauderdale, if you know it, the half that's west of US 1, and we redesigned many of those streets. The state owned a bunch of streets, and the county owned a bunch of streets. The ones that were left to the city were only about half.
Yeah. Yeah, we deal with that. I had a local politician, Guido Maniscalco. He's on city council here. And I said, how do we make Bayshore Boulevard safer? How do you make Dale Mabry safer? He's like, well, the county owns Bayshore. The state owns Dale Mabry. The state owns, I believe, West Shore Boulevard. These are our major thoroughfares in the city, and the city doesn't control them. Bayshore notoriously is like a racetrack. There were no traffic lights on it. Bayshore Boulevard. It's a unbelievably gorgeous linear park street, but the problem is the racetrack nature of it. It has those hard lines in the road. You do have a bike lane. I think if you bike there, you're crazy. You're asking for trouble. But the city has tried to work with the county to put in more traffic lights, and it's slowed people down. But that was only after a young mother and her little baby were crossing the street and were hit and killed by a younger kid driving in a Mustang like 100 miles an hour. So unfortunately, we have to wait for a tragedy to make a change.
But there's a confusion, again, at the traffic engineering level between speed and volume. So the engineers at the state, at the county, and potentially at the city in different places, they feel a mandate to maximize throughput. They feel a mandate to have as many vehicles making the most use of the facility as possible, since they're investing in it. But what they don't realize is that speed and volume are often two entirely different things. And in fact, once you get beyond a certain speed, I think it's in the low 30s, the volume, the capacity of a road reduces because of the attenuation of the vehicles. When you're going that fast, you're spreading out more from the car in front of you, and the road actually handles fewer cars per hour.
Interesting.
So there's this feeling that now adding signals is going to reduce the volume on a street. Adding stop signs very much might not. In fact, very often in places where we've worked, like in Albuquerque, where I replaced 7 signals with stop signs, they actually found people were getting through the downtown faster because they were never sitting waiting at a light. But in any case, if you can design a road so that people are driving more calmly and a little more safely, if it's particularly in a place where people are, you're not necessarily hobbling the capacity of the street, which is what the DOT cares about. But right. they value speed too highly.
Yeah, traffic is always like the number one complaint, of probably any growing population, right? More traffic. I'm sitting in my car for 2 hours a day. I think there's a large public push to reduce traffic. And
there's an illusion that adding lanes will solve that problem when it never, ever has.
No, and then back to the conversation about the underprivileged and the more poor communities all across the country. That was part of urban renewal, was to just say, hey, well, let's bulldoze these blighted areas, pop a highway through. It'll make traffic more efficient. It'll connect, our nation's cities together. But unfortunately, we destroyed, if you look at a picture of Tampa before and after, we probably destroyed 40% of our urban core just to put the highways in. And that happened everywhere across the nation.
And I have to say, while we were working on Water Street, which I'd be excited to talk about a little bit, the biggest challenge was to satisfy FDOT. And, FDOT makes all kinds of noise around context-sensitive design and caring about the communities that the roads go through. They've had some wonderful leaders there like Billy Hadaway, who did a fair bit to reform their approaches. But FDOT is still a problem in most of the places that I have worked in Florida. And the whole program they've got this pedestrian safety program at FDOT. Maybe you've seen the logos. It's been like 20 years, and I believe they have not changed this, even though I've shamed them at public conferences over it. But their logo and their slogan for pedestrian and bicyclist safety at FDOT is called Alert Today, Alive Tomorrow. And it's ostensibly a program that's going to make it safer for bicyclists and pedestrians, which you think would include some modifications to driver behavior.
You would hope.
But who needs to be alert to stay alive? Clearly, when a car hits a bicyclist or a car hits a pedestrian, it's the bicyclist and the pedestrian who isn't alive tomorrow. Yeah. So the entire slogan of Florida's pedestrian safety program is basically, hey, Mr. or Mrs. Pedestrian or cyclist, it's your job to keep yourself safe on the street. And don't worry about the drivers or worry very much about the drivers who are speeding horribly, and worry very much about the fact that we've engineered our streets so that they will do that. But the onus is on you to stay alive.
Well, at the end of the day, there is a balance between, hey, you probably should look both ways. You probably shouldn't ride your bike on freaking Dale Mabry Highway, right? Which the FDOT put bike lanes on, which I think is atrocious. Why even attempt to do that?
There are a lot of quote unquote complete streets. And Florida is one of many states that said, we're going to make sure every street is complete, that I would never bring a bicycle on.
No. And then to leave it up to the bicyclist to say, hey, just, watch behind you, make sure no one's going to hit you, stay alert, and put that responsibility on them. Yeah. It's a little silly. So the idea that they've had that policy for 20 years and haven't changed it, it's kind of makes you question the whoever's in charge up there.
Well, this has become a little bit much of a gripe fest for me. So let's talk about some positive things.
Sure. No worries. Well,
no, it's really easy. I mean, it's really easy to point fingers and deserve it, I should say. There's a lot of responsibility that needs to be leveled. However, we've been having great success at making places safer. We've been having great success at making better places. I think I haven't visited Water Street in 8 years, but I understand it's coming along very nicely. Your listeners may not be aware that Jeff Vinnick brought my team in to create the master plan for that district, which is still only about half done in terms of what we've planned. But, before we started that effort, the area around the convention center, arena, aquarium, and that little festival marketplace down there was, I think, named the second worst parking crater in the U.S. That's a contest that I think Plater-Zyberk has every year around who's got the biggest massive parking lots in an area that could be so much better.
Yeah.
And you had all these social anchors, tremendous social anchors, in one neighborhood, surrounded entirely by ugly surface parking lots. And the Water Street plan, which a number of us worked on in succession, first Urban Design Associates, then my firm with Stantec, and then Elkis Manfredi, which are friends of mine from Boston. They came in, and then a bunch of great architects got involved under the leadership of Jeff Vinnick, who owns the Lightning, who I believe has sold his interest to the other partner, Cascade, which is Microsoft money, who are also involved in our work. It's really turning that area into a great urban. Well, you tell me. I've been told it's a really nice neighborhood.
Well, first of all, real quick, I didn't mean it to turn into a gripe fest, but I think what's happening is there's a transition with my generation and younger generations that are frustrated with the way things have been going in terms of American downtowns. The good news is it absolutely is improving, and it's palpable. Yeah. A lot of these city streets have been repaved, reworked. We're going to re-brick streets. We're doing more pedestrian crosswalks. There's a tangible difference in the last 10 years. There truthfully is, and things are improving and getting better. And Water Street, by design, it's almost like the if you build it, they will come like mentality motto. You go to Water Street right now, there's 1 million people enjoying the outdoors, walking their dogs, enjoying time with family, eating at all the restaurants. It is a major success here, and it's been a defining development for our city. And I think a lot of the other large-scale developments have taken note at the design and the way it feels and the way you experience it. And they've implemented similar things in their projects. The good news is, yeah, absolutely. And the good news is, out of all of the atrocities that occurred in American downtowns, we mentioned urban renewal and the highway system and the parking lots, all of that, the silver lining is now we have an incredible opportunity to build new. Out of these parking lots, we can amass real estate, and these large-scale developments can be built. And that wouldn't occur if you didn't have so much empty land and empty parking spaces.
True enough.
So it's fantastic in a lot of ways that we have 100 acres in our urban core just waiting to be developed. Jeff Vinnick, he started out, buying all the land there. I believe it was 40 or 50 acres around Amalie Arena. Daryl Shaw has bought another 40 plus acres outside of Ybor. And then Ybor Harbor is probably another 30, 40 acres. You've got a significant amount of land to be developed into this new American walkable city, which we're talking about today. So it is super, super exciting. And there's a lot of great things to talk about. And I really appreciate seeing a concept turn into a practical application. Like going to Water Street, you feel like you're in a real city. You feel like you're in Boston. And the reality is people love it. People look around and they go, isn't this amazing? Like there is a tangible difference on people's faces when you're in some of these planned communities that are walkable. You can just tell by the vibe in the area that people enjoy it. So tell me, let's talk about Water Street. So the story goes, Jeff Vinnick read your book, Walkable City, right? And was inspired to reach out to you and ask you to help be involved in the project.
Yeah, it was a TED book. So, TED Talks I guess they have a subscription service that he belonged to, so that's why he had read it. And one day I got a call from his associate in his office and said that it wasn't even an interview. It was like, Jeff would like to hire you to do the master plan for Water Street. And what's really funny is that I was on my way to Siesta Key, and I actually had a lecture somewhere north of there. I forget where. I had a lecture. I think I had to leave my family for a couple days, and I was about to fly commercial, which is the way I almost always fly, to get to my lecture. And Jeff's people were like, "Oh, he's flying up to North Carolina for the Duke game. If you have to go north, why doesn't he give you a ride on his plane?" Oh, and I think he was picking up his son in Boston, and then going back south to the Duke game, the NC Duke game. And so he flew me to Boston and dropped me off.
That worked out perfect.
We had a wonderful conversation the whole way, and that started the project where we built a team and created the master plan that took big fat one-way streets through that area. You may not know that some of those streets were like 4-lane one-ways, and we turned them into 2-way, narrower streets, and essentially created the block network that it grew into, and just kind of inspired the mix of uses and the idea that it was going to be a complete neighborhood.
Yeah, Water Street is it's a great design. It's a grid system. Why is the grid system more efficient, Jeff? Why not use a sort of, I don't know, curvature in streets? Why is grid the way to go?
Grid's more efficient for building, but what really matters is that you have a porous capillary network of streets. And I call it that, putting together a bunch of words that all kind of apply to the idea that you want to have small blocks and a tremendous intersection density. So intersection density, the number of intersections per square mile, is about the single greatest thing that you can correlate to walkability and, honestly, real estate value. Like, small blocks are the way to go because they're incredibly resilient and flexible. And so the most walkable cities like Portland, Oregon, or the oldest parts of Boston and New York City, or European cities, have hundreds and hundreds of intersections per mile. And then you have the least walkable cities like Irvine, California, which over a square mile might have like 4 intersections, honestly. And you have that big block structure, which implies huge streets. A Portland, Oregon block is 200 feet across. A Salt Lake City block is 600 feet across. Salt Lake City, if you've been there, is much less pleasant and less effective to walk around. The most important planning book ever written was Jane Jacobs' The Death and Life of Great American Cities, the most influential planning book ever written. And she has 3 drawings in that book. The book is 1,000,000 words and 3 drawings. And the 3 drawings are in a section called The Need for Small Blocks. And she diagrams by mapping different paths through a large block and small block system just how much more effective, efficient, social it is to have lots of different ways to get around, different paths you can take to even the same destination. One day you can pass the dry cleaner. One day you can drop your kid off at school. One day you can do something else. But the idea that the system provides choice and also allows for growth. And the great thing about small block systems is that you can turn a village of shacks into a village of houses into a village of skyscrapers over time, and it still functions. And if you look at sprawl, which has the contrasting system, which is technically called a sparse hierarchy, or a dendritic system, which means a branching system, where every trip is from the local to the collector to the arterial to the highway and back again. And there's really only one smart path from anywhere to anywhere else, just one way to go. Those systems are incapable of molting. They have extremely low throughput for the number of lanes. And if you try to grow a sprawl city vertically, it chokes on traffic almost instantly, right? So one of the great ironies of sprawl is that it was designed around the automobile, but it functions worse for the automobile.
Right.
Because God help you, if you have one engine fire on your collector road, your whole city shuts down for the afternoon, right?
Right. Yeah.
Whereas I have this 5x5 grid that I use in my talks, where there's, I believe, 21 ways to get from the lower left of the plan to the upper right of the plan, and each way, is interesting and safe, and that's the way to go. So there are curvilinear grids that are pretty cool, like in some of Olmsted's communities. There are cranky grids, which are my favorite, which you'll find in any medieval city, or in the medievally organized parts of American cities like Wall Street or the Boston's financial district. Anything really built before the Enlightenment or laid out before the Enlightenment is going to have this sort of cranky grid with tiny blocks, the tiniest blocks. You can fit 100 blocks from Mykonos into a Salt Lake City block easily. Mm-hmm. So those are the models that we admire the most.
Yeah, that is such a weird conundrum, right? Like the suburban area was specifically designed for the automobile. Every errand is to be run in an automobile, and yet it's the least efficient form or a less efficient form than the urban grid system. Well, there's a lot of great changes that have occurred, and I think we are absolutely on the right track, at least here locally. And it sounds like you're working with a lot of projects around the country that get it, that are implementing a lot of these practices. So that's super exciting. Thank you for all the work you've done, Jeff, and thank you for being here today. I appreciate it. Thank you guys for watching this episode. If you enjoyed it, make sure to like it. Check us out on YouTube, subscribe to our channel, give us a comment, give us some feedback. We want to know how we're doing. Thanks for watching. Bye, everybody.